Good evening, everyone. Delighted to say we did at 5 o'clock for about 45 minutes a press one, at which all of us Corney and Barrowites had a glass ready, but it didn't somehow seem appropriate to start. So anyway, we I think with you, ladies and gents, we're going to actually enjoy a bit of wine, which is good. So look, we wanted to do this just really as a sort of nod to the fact that we haven't managed to do a tasting, which is a real shame. And as with everything last year and this, it's all been a bit different. But what we wanted to do was give people a chance to ask any questions and to go through a little bit about our sort of offering. What I was going to say really was that we always do Burgundy a little bit differently. So the offer that's on the Burgundy hub on our website at the moment is obviously a sort of basket of producers. And then we really spend the next 3 or 4 months going through the other producers that we do exclusively, that we put into sort of separate offers. And in fact, that started, Rebecca looks after Olivier Leflèvre, so that started back in August, September time with Olivier Leflèvre, then Domaine Leflèvre in December, and now the Burgundy offer, and on into other producers. So we like to take our time over Burgundy, and we like to give each producer a dedicated offer, so that we can talk through the wines and taste fully and do videos, etc., which has been a good development this year. But yeah, so that's that. We've done a lot of tasting of the vintage from samples, which I think Guy and Rebecca will say a little bit about, and it's been interesting. It's been different because so often in Burgundy by this time we would have spent about 3 weeks down there, one in September, one in October, one in November, tasting, but that obviously wasn't possible. So we've been tasting from the samples, and it's been fascinating, and it's a very interesting. I mean, Burgundy, you almost always find yourself saying it's an interesting vintage, and that's actually everything about the region is sort of personified in that, I guess. So there we go. What we wanted to do is go through a little bit of an intro from me, which is that, and then Guy will talk a little bit about the growing season, so a little bit of the vintage report, sort of condensed down. The full one's available on the site. We don't want to make this evening too academic particularly, but we'll take absolutely any questions you have about other producers, about the market, about what we're offering now and what's coming up. So I will hand over to Guy, who has, as we said, written feels like several books on Burgundy over the last few months, getting all the offers ready. But Guy, a little bit on the vintage.
Thanks, Will. Good evening, everyone. Good to see so many people here. So thanks all for joining. I'll just do a very brief sort of rundown on the 2019 vintage, without keeping it fun and informative, hopefully, rather than too boring. But just to pull out a few themes from the vintage, it's the latest in a run of good vintages from Burgundy. So in that sense, we've been very lucky to have 2019 hot on the heels of 2018, which was a sort of lush, quite ripe year. 2017, which appeals to the sort of traditionalists and was a very a Bourguignon vintage. 2016, which was rich and concentrated, and okay, there was hardly anything to go around, but it was very high quality. And then 15, which was similarly a nice sunny, ripe vintage. So we've been spoiled for choice in the last few years. How to differentiate 2019, therefore? The first thing to say in terms of the growing season is that it was a very dry start to the season, and going into 2018, for example, which was also a very hot summer, the soil water reserves in 2018 were a lot greater than they were in 2019. So the starting points for the current vintage was very dry, and really the rainfall throughout the growing season stayed below average. So we're looking at a dry year. So the first sort of starting point for 2019 was that it was going to be a year of low yields. That was the kind of starting premise, if you like. And that starting point was then exacerbated by the fact that we had frost in April. So there were 5 episodes of frost starting on the 5th of April, the 4th to 5th night of that first week of April, and then culminating in the first week of May. So in that sort of 4-week stretch, 5-week stretch, there were 5 different frost episodes. And that combined with the fact that it was very dry to begin with, and that the buds had started developing already because February was quite warm. So the actual growing season was ahead of itself by the point that the frost struck, meant that yields in Burgundy for 2019 are about 25% below the point that they were in 2018. So in terms of the 5-year average, they're over 10% below the 5-year average. And as I say, about a quarter less than in 2018. So that's kind of the bad news, if you like. But I mean, from a quality perspective, it doesn't really matter, because what was left was naturally concentrated. The fruit, the phenolics, the acidity, all of that was concentrated as a result of these low yields. And you then add in the fact that 2019 was very sunny and was warm. So it was about 15 to 20% sunnier than average. And it was about, during the growing season, about 2 degrees centigrade warmer than average. So those two things, combined with the fact that the yields were low, gives the character of a vintage which is rich in fruit, it's rich in phenolic content and tannin. The alcohol can be a little bit higher than average, but the acidity, crucially, is really nice and fresh. So you've got this sort of turning up the dial to 10 on any number of different sort of categories in the components of the wine, which makes for a really exciting vintage. Separating out just very briefly whites from reds, I would say that the reds are overperformers almost across the board. So I think the red 2019s are, there are some beautiful wines there, and wines that will show early and be quite easy to taste. Young, but then will also have great aging potential as well. The whites, a little bit more of a mixed picture maybe, but the best whites, the most successful whites are beautiful. And I mean, we released the Member Fleurs, for example, in December, which were an extraordinary set of wines. Places where people may not sort of go for the white 2019s to such an extent, they can be a little bit richer and they can be a little bit more sort of yellow fruited character in them. Personally, I think that's a nice attribute, but they are sort of the product of a warmer vintage in that sense. So okay, that's a very brief overview of the season. What we'll do now is I'll hand over to Rebecca, who's going to say a few words about Chablis, and then I will come back and say a little bit about the Côte de Nuit. Okay, Rebecca.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks very much, and welcome to everybody here. Good to see so many faces to join us this evening. I'll talk a little bit about Chablis because I look after this region as well as some others, but I'll focus on Chablis tonight. 2019 was a very expressive vintage, had a lot of depth and concentration as a result of the warm growing season, which Guy was just telling us all about. It was very sunny and temperatures were really pretty impressive. I mean, Guy talked about turning the dial up to 10. I reckon it went to 11 this year. We're up to 42 degrees in June and July, with some, a particular week, which was a real scorcher. And that was very significant. It's given this depth of fruit and concentration with the vines that could actually handle it. In those kinds of conditions, some vines will shut down, but luckily the better growers or growers that have the luck of having older vines will have weathered that very well. We offer Vincent Dante, Domaine Vincent Dante in our offer. He's a grower we've worked with for quite a number of years now, from his first vintage, in fact, in 2005. He is from a long lineage of winemaking. The Defay and Dante clans are well known in the Chablis region. And he inherited some very old vines from his grandfather, though of his own bat, he's managed to add to those. But he was lucky to have those vines to survive the drought and the heat of this summer. What was also crucial, I think, to the 2019 Chablis that I've tasted was a slightly cooler August. Luckily, despite this sort of huge swell of heat in June and July, August was surprisingly cool, and it just helped to retain those vital acidities, which so much the backbone of very good Chablis. And as a result, you've got this beautiful depth and richness, what the French call this gourmandise in the wines, but you've also got this pristine acid that has been retained also, and that has kept the wines fresh and just gives them the edge over some other vintages. So that's about it, I would say.
Moving north to south, this is the way we've sort of structured the regional look at the vintage. So passing to the Côte de Nuit, obviously this is Pinot Noir country largely, and as I said, Pinot was a great success in 2019. So I think the factors which from our tastings really stood out for me on the Pinot Noir was firstly that they're beautifully perfumed wines. There's this real aromatic delicacy and perfume and prettiness to the 2019s, which allied to the fact that the tannins, although there's quite a lot of tannin, the tannins are very supple and they're very melt in your mouth tannins. And so that makes them very easy wines to taste from Barrow even. And that's not always the case. So, you know, you look at a big Grand Cru like Clos Vougeot, for example, which in some years can produce wines which are quite austere and quite tannic and quite hard to taste. That hasn't been my experience with the 2019s. They've actually been a joy to taste, even from these quite historically tannic enclaves of Vougeot and Chablis and places like this, Maurice and Denis. There was a higher skin to juice ratio in the 2019s. That basically just means that the grapes were on average quite small. And so when you press them, the amount of skin relative to the amount of juice is quite high. That gives a rich character to the wines. And there's some quite deep colors in general in the Côte de Nuit Pinot Noirs. This is all to the good. They're rich wines, they're wines of substance, but they are, on the flip side, also wines of beautiful acidity. And the fact that the heat, I think, in 2019 came in waves rather than being consistent as it was in 2018, meant that there was a bit more breathing space between the peaks of heat. So as Rebecca said, we were over 40 degrees centigrade in a few periods in 2019, but in between those peaks, there was freshness and there was an ability for the acidity to be retained. And in addition to the concentration of acidity along with the concentration of flavor, this is made for really fresh, lively wines. So there's a real purity of fruit, I think, in the Pinot Noirs from the Côte de Nuit. So that would be, those would be my brief impressions. I will pass on to Joe, who's going to talk about the Côte de Beaune.
Hello, yeah, good evening, and yeah, thanks for joining. I won't go into too much repetition, too much stylistic difference. I mean, obviously the Côte de Beaune, we are predominantly famed for the great white regions, and a lot of the time the focus is on Puligny-Montrachet, Chassagne, and Meursault. And on our January offer, you know, there on the white side, we are probably, you know, we waited a little bit more to Meursault. We have more Chassagne and Puligny offers to come, which I know as a team we'll touch on a little bit later on in this little Zoom session, such as the likes of François Carillon, etc. But with the January offer on the whites, and what is key and what we sort of was the surprise factor is the acidity that has been mentioned, and that sort of vibrant acidity that is present in the whites, and a very obviously welcome presence. It's there, and it helps give this sort of this lift on the palate. It helps, you know, give the impression that there's actually tension in the wines, and some of these wines they really do. And obviously that will depend upon, you know, their appellation and where they do originate, and the different vineyards the grapes are grown and picked. I think personally with the January offer and the Côte de Beaune, a bit more of a spotlight should be put onto the reds, because in 2019 the big pleasant, I think, you know, nuance in the wine is the sweetness of fruit, and this really does benefit Côte de Beaune. You know, if you want to try and pin it on global warming, if you wanted to try and pin it on one particular vintage trait which has changed this. But within 19, you have a beautiful ripeness in the fruit in Côte de Beaune, which contributes to more refined, elegant palates overall. Yes, you know, if you look at sort of Pommard, where you have a more muscular, more structured tannic presence, even in Côte de Beaune Premier Crus, you have that sort of feel as well. And normally you get that crunchy red, sometimes even sour red fruit of pomegranate and cranberries. Here, you've got a riper, sweeter, cherried raspberry fruit, but then it's injection in certain cases of these lovely sort of concentrated black fruits as well. And I think the Côte de Beaune producers will be very happy if they've played the cards right, if they've managed the vineyards well, and they've stuck to their guns in the winery as well. And that's also translated aromatically into perfume. So this year, I would encourage you, the value buys, certainly in some of the Premier Cru Côte de Beaune vineyards, which have been within family generations, and as Rebecca touched upon as well earlier, with good vine age. You know, two sort of standouts for the white that I'd love to point you towards personally are two domains, one in Volnay, which is domain Glantoni, which is a brother and sister duo, Guillaume and Sarah. Guillaume and Sarah, you know, like many of the stories now in Burgundy, you've got these generational changes, which are a brilliant step forward, because they've been out, they've been learning at younger ages, more than their parents did, around the world. And they're coming back with more open opinion. And I think you're seeing this translate into incredibly well-made wines. This Glantoni is based in Volnay. There is, if you like, a sort of more pretty, aromatic and you know, very gentle, which actually is what I'm drinking at the moment, Volnay's 2017. Then I would certainly look at the Glantoni family and what Guillaume's making and the value there. And his Premier Cru, he has two Premier Crus, Brouillard and Ronceray. And you know, at 250 to 300 pounds a six, they are beautiful wines. I would also like you to sort of probably go to a slightly more unfashionable town in the Côte de Beaune of Santenay, where we work with a chap called Justin Girardin. You know, Domaine Vincent Girardin is maybe, if you've been buying Burgundy for a while, a name you're familiar with. He sold the domain to Justin Girardin's parents in 2010, and then Justin took sole control in 2015. Again, the familiar story of the younger generation coming through. And he's making Santenay Premier Crus. And Santenay, if you like a mineral-rich, very calcareous style of Pinot Noir, and encased in particular years like 19 in this sort of enriched, gorgeous fruit and this sweetness of Pinot, sort of, you know, persevering and through the palate, then these are perfect picks, and the value picks at 130, 140 pounds a six. So, you know, we'll have a further chat, obviously, all together now. But, you know, Côte de Beaune, the exciting points are the red, the fruit profile on the whites, the acidity, which has been mentioned, the tension that's been retained.
Well, I think that's grand. We've got our first question into the chat. And Guy, this might be one you know. So Thierry Glantoni is there are a few families around Burgundy. Rossignol is one where you tend to find there's one around every corner, particularly in Volnay. But Glantoni, there is another operation, isn't there?
Yeah, they're cousins. I can't remember exactly where the crossover is. I think it's at the sort of grandparents level, but they are cousins of some description. And yes, at some point the holdings were split between the two Glantoni families. Okay. And so this is Domaine Georges Glantoni that we work with.
And I think, fun enough, one of the, you could argue it's a charm of Burgundy, or maybe it's a curse, but there are always these complications. And Matro, which is a producer that's in the offer we've got out at the moment, is a classic. It used to sometimes have, some of the labels had Joseph Matro and some of the labels had Pierre Matro, but the domain was called Domaine Matro. And everyone's like, well, is it Pierre or is it? And in fact, they used to name the different labels were which member of the family owned that particular vineyard. So, but now, fortunately, it's Thierry and Pascal Matro, and they don't call the vineyards different things. But yeah, every time you think you might know a little bit about Burgundy, it tends to come around and give you a kick and tell you don't really. But yeah, no, there's that. One thing I was gonna say a little bit about was really, I think people often want to know what to look at in Burgundy, and I do think probably now more than ever, it's the producer is often king or queen in terms of what you should be looking for and getting to know. And it's quite interesting that in our tastings, in the few masterclasses, and for anyone who's coming along on Thursday to the Glantoni masterclass, which we can still probably get you the wines for, is really to get to know what the style of a producer is actually from bottles that are ready to drink or ready to taste, is actually really quite a good way to do it, rather necessarily than needing to taste the younger wines. So we hadn't looked too heavily into sending sort of test tubes of little vials of samples round to everyone, because we haven't found that worked as well. What we've wanted to do is to show people the style a producer aims to make, and then they can get a handle on it then that way. But I suppose what I might do if we're waiting for some more questions is to ask Joe, what would you say in terms of people say, should you buy the vintage or the producer?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think taking a leaf out of the book you were just sort of reading from, I think it's more a case now of producer. If I had a toss-up of a weak vintage from a great producer or a great vintage from a producer who's slightly less known or reputationally is a little bit sort of poorer, then I would always personally go for the producer, the domaine that you know behind the style that suits you and that has historically proven themselves vintage after vintage. I think, you know, those great producers and domains who've particularly at the sort of mid-higher level that have been through vintage after vintage and have a wealth of experience, they know how to really deal with the trials and tribulations of the difficulties that growing seasons can throw up. So yeah, personally, I think producer is key. You want to find the style that you identify with, that you have pleasure with, and run with them through youth and maturity. So, you know, you open them young, open a case young, you know, depending on the level of the wine. Village, you know, would always want to try within a couple of years of receiving it physically in bond or at home. Premier Cru within 3 to 5, and Grand Cru within 5 to 7, just to try that first bottle, because the beauty of the red side of great Pinot is that perfume and that sweetness is so incredibly intoxicating in its youth. And with whites, you know, if you've got a more of an austere a producer, which is all about focus and precision in its youth, it can feel quite closed and taut. There's no harm in trying that first bottle, because now, as we know, more and more with warmer vintages, and with, like we have with 19, you've got a textural richness there with the fruit. It's in, you know, it's sort of shepherded with that sort of acidity that's there. But yeah, I think go with producer first.
Okay, good. Now we have another one. And would you be able to point towards producers that have made a lot of progress this year and particularly improved? Okay, very, very good question. Guy, anyone stand out for you on that particular improvers?
Well, one of the names that sort of springs to mind is Justin Girardin, who's in Santenay, and he's a young producer that we've worked with since the 2015 vintage, which was his first solo vintage. I think he's doing great things. And I mean, what he does is he has 3 single vineyard Premier Cru Santenays, all of which, as far as I can tell, for every successive year, they seem to be sort of imprinting their terroir more and more into the character of the wines. And after all, that's really what we're looking for. I mean, we're looking for lovely fruit expression and lovely perfume, but more than anything, personally, I want to see what's behind the fruit, and I want to see what's going on in the vineyard. And he has these 3 different Premier Crus, which have different aspects, different altitudes, and for me, he is a producer which is really differentiating his different holdings, and he's now, this is his 5th vintage, yeah, I think he's a name on the up, and he's somebody that you should check out.
Yeah, may I add one?
Yep.
Yeah, I think another one. It's not in this January offer. In fact, it's sort of going live today, tomorrow. Would be Domaine Pierre Labbé, based in Beaune. And the reason I sort of bring them up is they've got a very famous they've got two domains, Château de la Tour in the biggest Grand Cru of Clos de Vougeot, which are stunning wines in 2019. That aside, it's more about the bone holdings that they have with Pierre Labbé, and they made a few changes in the vineyard in 2015, which I think now you've seen translate through the fruit over the last few growing seasons. In 19, that's come across particularly strongly, and so it's not a case of overall reputation of the men and the people behind it have changed, but the practices that they've put into the vineyard, and you've seen the reward with the fruit. So yeah, they are bone reds, bone whites, and some Meursault whites as well. So look out for that offer.
Very good. I noticed the next question we've got on, which leads quite interesting on something I'd like to ask Rebecca about. But so, have we tasted the cuvée Auglicienne from Chablis? We haven't yet, I'm afraid, and we will add our note as soon as we have. The Bourgogne Blancs from Chablis are amongst the very strongest in their category, I think, and quite rightly have a real loyal following because they punch well above their weight. But I think actually that really leads quite nicely on to Olivier Leflèvre while we're on Bourgogne Blanc, because Olivier is obviously one of our key producers based in Pouligny, but making a wide variety of wines. So Rebecca, what was your take on them in 19?
It was such an anomaly vintage, and it was very strange because I tasted the wines, because we normally put this offer out. In the past, we've put it out as early as May in the year following vintage, but we tend to put it out a little bit later now, partly due to other reasons, Bordeaux Primeur clash and all the rest of it. But I did taste them in May this year, and obviously they were still in tank, still pretty young. And I wasn't tasting at source because we were already in lockdown. I normally go down to Pouligny and taste with the winemaker Franck Grux, who some of you may have come across before. And it's a very informative tasting. We taste over a day. This year, Franck warned me that the vintage was completely different to anything that I would have been used to from Olivier Leflèvre. They normally pick very early. They're very interested in retaining acidity. This year, it was almost the opposite. The alcohols were at least a degree and a half higher, I think, in every single wine than I remember in 15 vintages. And I was worried because I thought perhaps the acid, might not be there, or I really didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't believe how fresh and succulent the acids were. And it was incredibly impressive to see the level of quality from bottom to the top. But I think the Bourgogne Blancs, to come to your specific question, Will, or to the theme, the Bourgogne Blanc level was really impressive. Olivier Leflèvre make their Bourgogne Blanc from a blend of fruit they have at sort of regional and village level in Pouligny, Meursault, and also some of perhaps the lesser known and traditionally less well seen villages, such as appellations like the Haute Côte de Beaune or Saint-Romain. And I was really impressed by the quality of this year.
Good. Yeah, no, I mean, I've always, and Franck is something of a wizard, and the amount of wines he manages to produce and make them all so different is incredible.
I think that's another thing. I think this year, and Franck is very modest, but he said I think it was huge relief when he tasted that. I mean, obviously he's tasting the wines all the time, but huge relief to see that actually, the wines were very, the word he always uses is typé, very typical of their site, very typical of their village, whereas you might have expected, with all this ripeness, that wouldn't be the case. But they're toned. They've got this tonic factor of this fresh acid, which has kept them absolutely on point, which is great to see.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Jonathan, who asked about the Augliciennes, that asked about the Lacetti versus Oncle Vincent. Did you taste the Oncle Vincent as well?
I have tasted Oncle Vincent. Oncle Vincent's just got more, has got more oak. It's got, you know, it's been in the gym for longer. We don't actually sell Oncle Vincent here in the UK. We've been long term supporters of City, but both very lovely wines. Oncle Vincent has just got a bit more steroidal oomph.
Yeah, no, a good phrase. And whilst we wait for some more questions coming, Joe, if there was a vintage you would encourage people to try young for Burgundy to get a feel for a producer, so which vintage of the last 10 years, or no, let's be more realistic, that's available, of the last 4 or 5 years, would you be tempted to say one white and one red, and maybe it's the same vintage?
The reds, I'd say 17. I think 17 its charm was there in barrel. You know, when we went and tasted in Burgundy, you could feel there's a sort of a nice mid-weight concentration of fruit, and there was a lovely sort of hint of sort of that velvety texture, but in an aromatic way as well. And that aromatic profile, whether that was in Côte de Nuit or Côte de Beaune, was present. And I think that's translated as it's, you know, being bottled, and now that it's sat in bottle for a couple of years. And so 17 reds, I think, are the ones to, if you were looking to approach young. For the whites, it would actually, I mean, if we could go to 50, I mean, I think 15 whites are just are brilliant. I love 15 whites. In 2020, which I know is a year we kind of all want to forget, the most white Burgundy vintage I drank was 15, and that was at Village, Premier Cru, and quite luckily on a few occasions Grand Cru. And even at Grand Cru, 15 white Burgundies are 100% getting into their swing. At Village, they're just, depending on the style of the producer, they are either at your sweet spot, or they may be towards that slightly more entering a sort of savoury character phase, which if you want. A Premier Cru, certainly, white 15s, beautiful. If you wanted to go younger, I'd actually go probably 18 whites over 17 whites, because I think 17 whites are stunning. There's so much acidity there. There's so much vibrancy and energy in 17 whites that you want to park that and put in a cellar. So yeah.
Okay.
Slightly underrated vintage, but the 13 vintage, I think, for whites is delicious as well. And it was quite sort of jarringly acidic when it first came out. I remember tasting it from barrel, but it really found its equilibrium quite nicely. And I think some of the 13s from Francois Carillon, for example, are showing beautifully.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, he nailed it in 13. So someone's come up with which of the upcoming individual releases would be your pick. Now, I mean, you know, I'm probably about the most hideously biased person here, but a few that I would particularly mention. I mean, Domaine Arnaud Lachaud, which comes up in March, has had great plaudits, but really is an exciting one to work with someone who is just getting an amazing amount of sort of good press, and the wines are gorgeous. I have the 2017 Pinot Fin on the go here, but I think there's a couple of others I might mention, and they might not be exactly what you would expect, but we've got a very exciting new, or it's not a new relationship, but a new offer, which is from Domaine de Vilaine. Now, the Vilaine name, be it Hyde de Vilaine or obviously Aubert from Romney Conti, is a well-known name in Burgundy, but their own family estate has been buying up some biodynamic vineyards over the last, or a couple of estates over the last few years, and we're very excited to release in about a month's time an offer of 6 different Rui Premier Crus, all from the same producer, which will be fascinating and I think really interesting, because it'll give everyone access to sort of top drawer winemaking, but also in a very Burgundian way, in that you'll be able to see the intricacies of it, and these will be wines that'll age, but they will be exceptional, I think, from young as well, and you'll be able to see exactly what they're about, which is great. And one other before I see who else has sort of something to chip in on this one, the D'Angeville wines this year, picking up on Joe's point about the Côte de Beaune and how maybe the Côte de Beaune really surges forward when you get these ripe vintages. And I love the 18s, but the 19s are from D'Angeville are an absolute knockout. and it's one of the most iconic estates, obviously in Volnay and in the Côte de Beaune. But I think the wines from the Bourgogne Rouge and Aligoté, which we might possibly cover a little bit later, upwards are just gorgeous. They're so pretty. They're the sort of wines that if I sneak a case or two aside, I'm going to have to make sure I don't get them delivered, because I just know they'll disappear as soon as they come in the door, unfortunately. I seem to have very bad evaporation in this house. I don't quite know how it happens, but yeah, I mean, Bex, Guy, Joe, any particular ones you're more excited about than the others even?
Well, you mentioned,
go.
just very quickly, you mentioned Arnaud Lachaud, but I mean, Charles Lachaud has just released his own Negociant line of wines as well, which I just have fresh in my memory because I tasted the 2019s a few days ago. And they're beautiful. They're really, really nice wines. He makes one white, which is an Aligoté from Old Vine Aligoté, owned by Domaine Arnaud Lachaud, but it's never been bottled under their label. So that's a real pick. And then he makes some lovely reds, including a Souchot for the first time this year. So there are some really nice wines to look for.
Yeah, I mean, on a white point of view, I personally would probably like to highlight, we've, for a couple of vintages now, started working with Domaine Primeur, and they are a very historic domain. Primeur would probably consider one of my, if not favourite, white winemaker of all time. I've been lucky enough to try some of his own wines from his own domain when he had a métillage deal with Lafon back in the 70s and 60s, all the way through to obviously Domaine de Flève. Many of you might know, probably know him best from when he was a winemaker at Domaine de Flève. His daughter Anne's taken over, so very excited of that offer. And then, I mean, yes, we've mentioned Charles Lachaud. You know, unquestionably, he's a bit of a rock star at the moment in Burgundy. But the offer that I'm, you know, which encompasses both probably Domaine Jacques Prieur and Nadine Goublin, who makes the wine there, is just gives it will give us, and as Corney's gives us a brilliant range to sell from. I mean, they're based in Meursault, but their holdings are spectacular across Grand Cru level, Premier Cru, and Village. And I mean, really, you know, they made a lot of changes in 2008, and from pretty much, I think, definitely from 2010, even though 09 was a big vintage, obviously in Burgundy, but from 2010, they've just been singing. And since we've been working with them since 2013, we've seen just consistent brilliance from Nadine and Edouard Lapriere and the team there.
Brilliant. No, I could not agree more. Now we have a tougher question coming up. But first, someone's asked about the Trappé A Minima. Jonathan, thanks for that. Trappé for me is, if people talk about Charles Lachaud and things as being a sort of a rising star, I think if you were to look at someone whose reputation maybe has, or they've not pushed themselves forward as much, but have been making brilliant wines and are surging forward again, would be Trappé. And I think the A Minima wine, which is a blend of Gamay and Pinot. I had a bottle of the 17 not long ago, just to obviously get in the mood for the Trappé 18 release. It was work, not obviously pleasure at all. Was absolutely delicious. So I'm a big fan of that, and I think a little bit like Aligoté is improving in Burgundy. Certainly wines from Gamay and of course the wines from the Beaujolais Crus are making some very, very exciting things. So the Pas du Grain, which I think, you know, Aligoté used to have cassis in it, and Pas du Grain used to be sort of what people have put their Boeuf Bourguignon or whatever in. Absolutely not the case now. These wines are getting ripe and full, but they're lovely and pure and not heavy. So I'm a big fan of people doing that. He's also put a far more funky, well, it's always had a quirky label, A Minima, but it's got a very sort of wine bar stylish, Instagram friendly label on it now. So you know, it's quite fun. So now we have Mr. Beresford, David, well done. A tough question. Amongst all of this, are there any disappointments Appellations growers? Very quickly before the others maybe say, I think, as Guy slightly did too, whites are a little bit trickier in places because there was that heat in sort of July and August, but there shouldn't obviously be a problem there. And I think actually at the moment it's, and this is a very wine merchant answer, there haven't been any obvious real problems. What will be interesting to see, though, is how, given the reputation, particularly on the reds, for the vintage being a very serious vintage, I'm not going to say, you know, greatest or whatever, is how they age in barrel. And I think the fact that people don't use too much oak, too much new oak now, will be a massive benefit. And actually, we're seeing less change. I think maybe 10 years ago, you would sometimes taste wines from the barrel in November or whatever, and they'd be gorgeous. But by the time you tasted them a year later and they'd been bottled, etc., if they'd sat in new oak barrels for another 8-9 months, you're dealing with a very different beast that might age and become graceful again, but you didn't know. I think with far less new oak now, I think the chances of the wines that we taste now being a real true representation of where they will come, I think it is a far more consistent thing, which I think is very positive. But we didn't experience that I did anything that I was not happy with, and we make a point of not offering wines with a note or using anyone else's notes, because it's you're our customers and we have to back up what we say. But I mean, Guy, you anything sort of stand out?
I'm not going to throw any of our producers under the bus, because I genuinely didn't taste any shockers, which I think need to be brought to people's attention. But I think the one thing that, if you taste in yourself in due course, the thing to look out for was that there was a sudden rise in ripeness towards the final days of the season. So if people picked maybe a day or a couple of days too late, that could have made a big difference in 2019, because the sugar ripeness was accelerating very quickly, the alcohol was going up quite quickly, and the tartaric acidity was dropping quite quickly. So that was where it became crucial to pick at the right time. But as I say, I genuinely haven't tasted any which I thought were big monstrous wines.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some out there. But,
a point, if I could add, which also goes back to what Rebecca was saying in 19, I think, and this is not just our opinion, it's sort of being spread a bit by a lot of people who've tasted in terms of critics. It translates the terroir and the vineyards and the identity and the typicity brilliantly versus other vintages, and certainly, potentially versus 18, where you had sort of more ripeness and more opulence, which maybe slightly masked that terroir style. 19 has, yes, brilliant, almost on point, perfect sweetness in many cases, but which is just combined with that sort of mineral definition. So I think, what 19 is going to provide is a lot of fun. Down the line, say with whites, take Meursault, for example, you could do at some point in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And in this early stage, it's harder to tell. But, the cooler vineyard sites versus the warmer vineyard sites, there'll be a real difference. For example, Perrier versus Charme, and then you've got TA in somewhere in the middle stylistically. It'll be quite fun to see how they change. And that's when I think you'll then maybe, detect and uncover who were the disappointments.
Okay, and then we've got an almost inevitable question, which I'm pleased has come up actually. So prices during the last Bordeaux campaign were pretty restrained. Not sure Burgundy is following the same path. Agree, disagree? ? Right. So yeah, I mean, to deal with the first part of that, Bordeaux obviously was during the very early days of what clearly was sort of when everyone I think was realizing the pandemic wasn't going to be a sort of two or 3 week sort of bump in the road. So they did react in the correct way. I think there's a slight difference between the two, because I think that Burgundy is very attached to its drinking, in the vast majority of cases, to its drinking sort of public. To us, we've got bottles open and things, whereas I think Bordeaux has always relied on people aging, historically, particularly the Anglo-Saxon markets, aging the wines themselves. And therefore you're buying very much for the future. So there is an element to which people, want Bordeaux to sort of wipe its face, whether that means covering the storage or meaning, you could sell a case later and it would pay for the drinking of another or whatever. Burgundy has always been a more hand-to-mouth existence. But I think it's 19, we've seen in most cases, people have kept their prices fairly consistent. The exchange rate, which is certainly not a topic I'm going to be too drawn on, given it's linked to the B word, has changed. And so that's absolutely for sure. a little bit from last year. But most of the producers we've spoken to, I think, given that they could have said, well, we're 25, 30% down, so the price has got to go up, which is never a very logical negotiating stance, but it does happen. I think they've kept them fairly much the same as last year, given that that is a reality about the less crop. But yeah, so it's been interesting. I think we haven't seen anything too scary in terms of price rises. And working exclusively with producers, in the most case, we would, you know, have we encourage them to let us know what they're thinking ahead of time, because, you know, one thing is the quality of the vintage, and the other thing is the market. And the market in Burgundy, I think, as long as they are realistic and don't jump the prices, is likely to stay there. But it'll be interesting to see how it develops, and who knows what will happen next year with 2020. But there we go. Joe, any comments on that one?
No, yeah, I mean, I agree thoroughly with that. I mean, it is difficult, and I agree there are, out in the open market, there are producers who have continued to put their prices up a certain amount and a certain amount. However, in some cases, I think there are mitigating circumstances. Again, you know, we talked about generational changes, and these generational changes have genuinely brought in a huge step forward in quality, in some cases in demand. They have taken them from a more rustic, slight producer and now into the realms of being recognised and talked about and appreciated by a greater crowd for different reasons. And that's happened because of, you know, things they've implemented into the demand, which have cost them money. You know, if you spoke to the Bourguignons, they will say the difference being, you know, a second growth Bordeaux can make 20,000 cases a year. So they're making sometimes 700 cases. And they've had, in the last decade, particularly in places like Volnay, horrendous climatic conditions which have intervened and ruined crops, whether that be hail, frost, sunburn. So on a whole, yes, I understand the sentiment that there seems to be a bit of a continual rise, but it's not a broad blanket generalization that should be sort of appreciated by people. It needs to be taken case by case because it's so much more complex.
I think also you've got different areas that are up and coming. There is climate change. There are villages that perhaps people might not have considered before, perhaps in earlier sort of classifications wouldn't have ranked quite so highly, and which you should really keep an eye out for. You know, talking earlier to the press about villages that keep getting mentioned, you know, Saint-Romain, Haute-Côte de Beaune in white, you will, you know, sites at the top of plateau that perhaps, you know, were too cool before, which now are not, you know, whether that's Saint-Aubin Premier Cru or whatever it might be, you know, Pernon-Vergelès, parts of the Hill of Courton. So I think there is a lot still to be discovered, and there's a lot also up and coming, the Côte Chalonnaise, and also the Mâconnais, when we are going to see now the Premier Crus, first Premier Crus coming out of Pouilly-Fuissé, for example. There's still a lot to be found.
Not forgetting Beaujolais as well, which is back on the calendar in a big way. And both Fleury and Moulin Avant feature in our releases and are well worth looking at.
Exactly right. So David's come in with another question, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about the growers of Corton, Chambolle, Gevrey and Moret, and are they up to the usual standard? Yeah, I think, personally, I think they are. I think what we've maybe overemphasized is that there's an added dimension of richness to some of the wines that might necessarily sometimes be almost too elegant in the Côte de Beaune. But I don't think there's anything to fear further north. In fact, the sort of silken textures you get, certainly with Chambolle and Moret, etc., are very, very good. Corton is more difficult. We haven't actually tasted Bonnet de Martre, is the Corton red that we do. We haven't tasted yet, and that's actually not that unusual. We normally taste it sort of from now onwards. But they seem to be good. And again, Corton as a red region has not historically been one that's got wonderfully ripe. It's often Adam, our MD, who I'm sure a lot of you know, always describes it as the sort of grit in the oyster, and that it really is it a sort of proper Grand Cru? Well, he changed his mind when Remy Conti got some. But no, it's a sort of different, it's a different beast. But no, those regions have done really well. I think but I think those are the areas where it'll be interesting to see how people's aging goes, and things. But I think no, they've done very well. I wouldn't have any hesitation in supporting those producers that you like. I think they've done very well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add that I think Corton, can in a cooler vintage be sort of a little austere, and I think in a vintage like 19, it benefits that sort of mineral steely style. I think there's a bit more flesh on the bone. I mean, we did taste the Domaine Jacques Brière Corton, for example, which lovely and succulent. So I mean, I think it seems to have done well in Corton. Chambol, I would single out the sort of perfume. I mean, I think there's a real pretty aromatic expression to 19, and that definitely is the case in Chambol as far as I've seen. Gevrey and Moret, more sort of muscular, sort of powerful villages, but everything we've tried from both of those has been nicely in proportion. So yeah, I think very much the usual standard, if not better.
And it's fascinating to see that over the years, Neuilly-Saint-Georges, which is almost everyone's favourite village in Burgundy to pronounce, has so often got forgotten, I think. And actually, Guy, I would agree with what you were saying about Charles Lachaux's wines. His Neuilly-Saint-Georges, I thought was exceptional. So I think there are a lot of good. There are still a lot of real gems to find in Burgundy. I love the wines of Marcenay, for instance. I tend to find those from. There are some brilliant producers, the likes of Roti and Trappé and many, many more who we don't look after, but that we do, where, Gevrey producers often have a little bit of land in Marcenay, and they make no less effort with that. And I think that's where Burgundy can be terrific. And I always remember Rebecca saying, 7, 8, 9 years ago, you could buy Polini for the price you can now buy Saint-Aubin. And that's a reality. Those are the prices that are going up, but I think justifiably in the sort of what were historically seen as the mid-ranking appellations or the entry-level appellations. I think they are making better and better ones. So yeah, brilliant. Do we have any more questions? But it's 5 to 7. Everyone's been brilliant. It's been lovely to be able to have a chat to you all about this. So if there are, quickly whack them in the chat box. But otherwise, please be in touch about the offers. We're always very happy to talk about our wines and even other people's at times. But we're here to help. Contact whoever you normally speak to. We really look forward to having a tasting again next year, we hope, and to get back to more normal events. But we have events the next few Thursdays coming up. Next week, Edouard Labruyère and Francois and Edouard Labbé on the next Thursday, and the following Thursday we're looking at Edouard Labruyère. You can see why I get my Edouards confused. And then the week after it is Pierre de Benoit from de Villaine. So there'll be plenty of things coming up to hopefully keep people satisfied and engaged. And yeah, keep drinking Burgundy, and take very good care of yourselves. Good day. Take care now.